It's my distinct pleasure to introduce David Fieldsend. He's the chairman of the think tank Salix. Thanks to Salix, we're able to arrange this conference. They sponsored us with some money, and he was also the chairman of the team that published the review on persecuted Christians that was handed over to the British Foreign Office, also the brittiska Utrikespolitikens this summer. And I just wanted him to share some of the findings and the reasons for why the review. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I've been chairman of Salix since 2010, and I still am, but that's a voluntary capacity. And the rest of my life until last October, I was working in Brussels in the Archbishop of Canterbury's representation to the EU. And I retired from that back home to Cornwall in the UK, and I resolved not to take on any regular commitments, at least until Christmas, and have a little sabbatical while I thought what the Lord would want me to do next. And no one was more surprised than me when the answer came the day after Christmas. We call Boxing Day in the UK, when the Foreign Secretary announced that he'd commissioned the new Bishop of Truro, the Right Reverend Philip Mount Stephen, that happens to be the part of the UK where I'm living now, to lead an independent review into the activities of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office relating to the support of persecuted Christians overseas. And it just so happened, providentially, that Bishop Philip and I had served together on previous committees here on the European continent, and so he got in touch with me straight away to be team leader for the project. But why had the Foreign Secretary commissioned this review in the first place? Well, firstly, this was a personal mission of the Foreign Secretary from his own faith experience. In his youth, he'd read the book God's Smuggler by Brother Andrew and developed a prayerful interest in the persecuted church and the work of Brother Andrew's ministry, Open Doors, from then onwards. It was also a response to the head of steam that had been building up for some time, coming from the all-party parliamentary group in the Houses of Parliament on freedom of religion and belief, and a number of NGOs and churches who've been campaigning for more to be done by the UK government to assist persecuted Christians. There had been very high-profile interventions by the British government in support of the desperate plight of the Rohingya Muslims in Burma, the Baha'i community in Yemen, the Yazidis in Iraq, etc., etc. But there seemed to be a distinct gap in the UK diplomatic assistance as far as suffering Christians were concerned. This pressure came to a head of the case of Asia Bibi, imprisoned on a capital charge of blasphemy in Pakistan. Her supporters and lawyers knew that even if she eventually achieved an acquittal under the official law system in Pakistan, unofficial law in the guise of mob justice would nevertheless still pursue her. So they pleaded for a Western government to be willing to take her in and give her asylum. This plea was relayed to the very top, to the Prime Minister's office in number 10 Downing Street, but was met with a flat negative answer. Britain would not give sanctuary to Asia Bibi. Why was this so? Two possible reasons have been advanced to me by different sources, not necessarily in conflict with each other. One was security concerns relating to the volatile situation in Pakistan and the Hang Asia Bibi movement, who had mass demonstrations outside the Western embassies in Islamabad. The head of the UK diplomatic service said on TV that if asylum was offered to Asia Bibi, he would have to close the UK mission in Islamabad and recall the staff to the UK because their lives would be in danger. The other factor was concerns for UK security in the event of Asia Bibi being admitted to the country. Threats to public order from violent demonstrations and to Asia Bibi's own life were a risk the authorities were not prepared to take, quite apart from the cost of providing indefinite close protection for her and her family. In his Boxing Day statement, Jeremy Hunt identified a number of possible causes for the blind spot for persecuted Christians that his staff seemed to have developed. awkwardness about doing God, post-colonial guilt, and fearfulness of being seen to impose our majority faith on others. He summed them all up as misguided political correctness, which he wanted his independent review to address. And a two-part exercise was proposed. Number one, gathering of evidence as to the extent of the problem, and number two, assessing the response to date of the UK and other governments and making recommendations for improvement. This all sounds very straightforward, but let me assure you it was not. From the start, there was a gap to be bridged in the understanding of just what the term independent review meant. That was what the Foreign Secretary had said he wanted, and he commissioned our bishop to deliver it. But the officials we had to deal with in his department, understandably, I suppose, as it was their work or lack of it that we were to review, initially thought that an independent review should be entirely staffed by their fellow civil servants. But we knew such a review would be ineffective, not least because key witnesses had told us they would only divulge information to us in confidence and were not prepared to be interviewed by Foreign Office staff or have their written submissions on an FCO database. Negotiations ensued, which eventually led to a face-off between Bishop Philip and the Foreign Secretary before January the 30th was set as the official launch date for the project. I'm skipping a bit here. After this launch, the later final agreement of terms of reference, a programme of work was able to be undertaken with 4 key elements. Number one, a survey of church leaders and anti-persecution NGOs worldwide to record their experience of the activity or inactivity on this issue of British diplomats abroad and those of other Western governments. 2, a programme of visits to countries with recorded persecution to talk directly with church leaders and diplomats on the ground. 3, choosing from the deluge of correspondence received with written submissions covering all 6 continents and our network of contacts that we got together what we hoped was a representative sample of witnesses to call to give the team oral evidence in half-hour slots over 2 weeks in the hallowed precincts of Westminster Abbey. 4, a survey of all 200-plus UK diplomatic missions was also undertaken to record their understanding of the priority of support for persecuted Christians and the extent of their involvement in it. The UN, EU and the foreign offices of other Western governments were also visited to ascertain the extent of their engagement on the issue. At the end of April, an interim report was published summarising our findings in relation to the extent of the problem worldwide, illustrated by regional and country interview overviews and individual case studies by country, with 7 countries picked out for special attention. There then followed an intensive exercise of analysis of the 2 surveys we'd carried out and the information gained in our national study visits. From this, we were able to expose an often substantial gap between what diplomats' understanding of the priority they were giving to this issue and the experience of those suffering persecution. In one country, the British mission staff maintained when visited that there was no persecution of Christians in their country. The very same day, a report was released from the National Human Rights Commission in that country, stating that a senior pastor who had been disappeared by a snatch squad in the night, and a Muslim imam was also disappeared around about the same time, had definitely been incarcerated by the state security forces. In another country that I visited, UK diplomats maintained that armed violence by Islamists against Christian villagers was purely an environmental dispute between herders and farmers, despite the fact that killing the priest or pastor and burning down the church was usually the opening act of violence. Our final report, published in July, and all this is available online, www.christianpersecutionreview.org.uk. Contained 22 recommendations for change under 3 headings. Number 1, making freedom of religion and belief central to the Foreign Office's culture, policies and international operations. 2, developing a religiously literate local operational approach, so that those on the ground in embassies in these countries where religion was the dominant force in society should actually know something about religion and be able to engage sensibly with those involved and get to know the local religious leaders. 3, strengthening joined-up thinking. We realised that this was not just a Foreign Office matter, that what other ministries did, the Home Office, the Ministry of Defence, the Overseas Aid Ministry in particular, all contributed to the problem. And lastly, we asked that a further independent review to see if these recommendations would actually be implemented should be held after 3 years. I'm very happy to report that both the then Prime Minister Theresa May and the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson are on record as having agreed to the implementation of all 22 recommendations. One of them, the upgrading of the post of Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Freedom of Religion and Belief and freeing it from any ministerial responsibility. Before this happened, the same person was a responsible minister in 2 government departments and also supposed to be Special Envoy on top of that. Well, we've got rid of that. We've now got one person nominated to do the job, who at the time was a Member of Parliament before the election was called Raymond Chistey. That's the background. That's where we are. As you know, we're in the middle of an election campaign in the UK at the moment, so who will be Prime Minister on December the 13th is anybody's guess at the moment. But I value your prayers that whoever it is will also be loyal to these commitments of their predecessors. It's been a very interesting exercise to engage with secular civil servants and the whole structure of government to try and firstly shed light on what was going on, but also try to start changing the culture. I'm sure similar things happened in Sweden, but over the last years since the economic crisis in 2008, the funding for our diplomatic service has been quite drastically reduced, and so the staffing has been reduced. So they're ever more selective on what they actually take on as priorities. And although there is a central Foreign Office guidance document on freedom of religion and belief and the duty of the Foreign Service to promote it, we found many embassies that had never heard of it, and even those that have heard of it who had never actually done anything about it, because there was no formal structure and process which made them report about it and monitored their activities. On the training side, there was the real lack of religious literacy, particularly amongst the younger generation, who just didn't understand what religion was all about, and yet were trying to engage with these very different societies and their very different views of religion. And lastly, particularly where it comes to the joined-up thinking, the really big problem we identified was that the aid agencies internationally and in the UK have a doctrine of being religion blind in who aid goes to, which meant that in countries where you have a dominant majority religion, if you're not very careful, and they weren't, all the aid goes to those who are in the majority religion, and the minority gets left out. I've probably said enough by now, and I'm very happy to answer questions.